a judge to order an examination of the person in crisis so that they can determine where they need services and how to access those services so that they can leave crisis. We see this bill working in a number of ways across the country to reduce suicide, to reduce interpersonal violence, and in addition to that, it helps in a number of cases, it helps to significantly increase the mental health services and behavioral health services that people who are in crisis are being exposed to, so that they can remove themselves from crisis period and not subject themselves to further criminal activities that will become criminal. I'm really stumbling with my words today. Does anybody, nope, I'm not gonna ask that yet. I'd like to introduce our panelists and thank them so profusely for being here. This is a hard topic to discuss. It's become very divisive, but we are so thankful to be able to at least have the conversation here. Our first panelist is Brandon Roper. We met him at a different panel that we actually had over the winter on ERPO. He came just to kind of check it out and see what he thought about things. He is the third place winner of a sharp, interesting perspectives on ERPO and how they apply to and protect Second Amendment rights. We have Erin Jemison, who's here from the YWCA. I could say a million good things about Erin.
Let's just do natural.
Okay. I love Erin. She's really, really funny. She's very good at her job. She's really nice to me.
I'm kidding.
Oh, okay. Okay. Erin's here with the YWCA, and she is going to be speaking a little bit about how ERPO impacts clients that she represents in the domestic violence community. And we're so thankful for Erin taking time out of her day to come, and she's a very busy person, as are all of you on the panel. And we have Chief Ross, who is here to help us understand the history of the bill a little bit and how this intersects with law enforcement. He was in on the conversations about red flag bills very early on and helped us at Action Utah and helped the sponsor last legislative session and the legislative session before that shape a bill that would be more protective for law enforcement, as well as give law enforcement the tools that they needed to temporarily remove or disarm a person in crisis. And we appreciate his time. And we have Kim Meyer, who is, I don't know exactly your title, but she is a suicide prevention specialist. Okay, and she's a rock star and she knows everything. So if anybody has any questions about suicide prevention and what other aspects that the state is working on to arrive at a place where we are preventing the most suicides in a place that we have a rising rate of suicide, ask Kim, she's a genius. So thank you all for coming and we appreciate your time. I'm still talking. Still me? Okay. All right, great. So we want to talk obviously about this bill, and I wanted to start with a question directed at kind of all of you. And are you supposed to have microphones?
Yeah, there's two for them to
These?
share.
Okay. Really good at posting things.
Check, check. All right, that works.
Yeah, you can share them. You can fight over them. That's fine. You can share.
Test.
Okay, I would like to pose this question to the group. Yeah, that's on fire. That's a hot mic. Okay, now recognizing that not all of you can speak for your organizations on supporting a concept or supporting the bill specifically, because we don't currently have language for a bill that will run in 2020 and we won't know that for quite some time. Why do you think that extreme risk protective order red flag bill would be important for Utah? And how can it impact the people you represent? Actually, I want to just target Brandon because he looks nervous.
Okay, so you want me to try to answer that question?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well,
yeah, that's fine, right?
I'm not here in any official capacity. I am an NRA certified firearms instructor. I've been a conceal carry instructor. I've been deeply entrenched in the competition shooting world. I've fallen into this role in working with this organization somewhat haphazardly, but from the gun owner's perspective, I think it's important that we get involved in this discussion because, one, they've been around for upwards of 20 years. Red flag law, the original one, I believe, was in Connecticut in 1999. And so if it was going to be found unconstitutional, that would have happened already. We've got one more states enacting these laws, and we're now looking at federal laws. We've got politicians on both sides of the aisle coming together to try to come up with something federally. So if we don't engage proactively, we're going to see them happen, and I personally believe that these laws could come into play that become very restrictive to Second Amendment rights. And if we don't proactively engage and help form these laws, then we're going to end up with something I don't think that the gun owner community likes. Secondly, and I think this is extremely important, that if a person is struggling with violent urges or suicidal ideation, we've identified somebody that is struggling. Why wouldn't we want to create some kind of a safety net for that individual? If the person is a gun owner, and I'm a fellow gun owner and I'm part of that community, why wouldn't I want to help that person? I said this one time somewhat flippantly, but and I don't mean to make light of the topic, but dead people don't have Second Amendment rights. They lose them when they die. So if someone is suicidal, why wouldn't we do something to help that person? If they're potentially violent, we need to do something to help that person. So we need to proactively engage in this process. That's why it's so important to me.
Great, thank you. And I want to, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, Andrea? She's not in here. Oh, there she is. You have talked a lot about, this being a tool in the toolbox and a last resort tool, right? Now, your community, and I know that Clark is here, has worked really hard on educating the gun owning community on best practices and safest practices, right? When someone is in crisis, best case scenario is we're using a safe harbor law, which is a law that allows somebody who's in crisis to turn in their firearm to law enforcement, right? That's best case scenario. Second best case scenario, or first best case, I would imagine, is somebody calls you, Brandon Roper, and says, hey, I'm in crisis and I need you to come hold my firearm. That's best case scenario.
Yeah.
So can you just talk a little bit about why this extra tool is important?
Yeah, I've had that exact experience happen. A good friend of mine called me and said, potentially going through a divorce here with my wife, this was all new information to me. He explained his situation. He said, can you store my firearms for me for a few weeks? And fortunately, it all worked out. But unfortunately, there are people that get into emotional situations where they don't have that personal awareness, self-awareness. They don't have that insight, and they can't necessarily handle the crisis on their own. And so the people that surround that person need to come together and try to figure out what to do. Right? So what does that look like? How do we handle that situation without infringing on rights? But how do we ultimately put the top priority as being the well-being of that individual, and in an ancillary sense that affects the well-being of everybody that surrounds that individual? So how do we target that person and start to say, not as criminal, because I know the gun community looks at it that way. They say, well, this person hasn't committed a crime, why are we taking their guns away? Well, that's not the perspective we need to have. The perspective we need to have is that this person is potentially in crisis. So that crisis could end up in a tragic event. How do we intervene?
Thank you. Erin, do you mind answering this question for somebody who represents domestic violence?
Sure. So I think, first of all, thanks for having me. Thank you all for being here. I think from I didn't hear what she said. From a domestic violence perspective, I think one of the first things to say up front is that domestic violence and access to firearms is a complex issue. For any of you who have been on the Hill and been in hearings around some of these issues, I would never walk up to a survivor or a person in an abusive situation and tell her to have a firearm or not to have a firearm. I think individual survivors and people in these situations have very different opinions and views on this. From a statistical perspective, we know that when firearms are involved in domestic violence households, there tends to be tragedy, that when someone is in crisis, these situations are incredibly emotional and get heightened very quickly, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that it doesn't end in tragedy for anyone in the situation. I think one of the things that the domestic violence advocacy community gets frustrated with when we're having conversations about firearms across different issues is that women are being killed by firearms at the hands of people in their home every single day in this country, and not that frequently, but too frequently in the state of Utah. And so how do we address that issue even when it's not the issue that's always making the headlines? So we already have the ability federally and in state statute to prohibit someone from purchasing a firearm if they have a domestic violence conviction or are under a protective order. I think what an ERPO bill would do would help create a relinquishment procedure for those situations. So nationally and in Utah, I think domestic violence advocates are very clear that an ERPO is one, I hate to keep saying tool in the toolbox, but it's one tool in the toolbox. We would never want an ERPO statute to replace our current domestic violence protective order statutes. Those are more comprehensive. They do deal with firearms, but they also deal with a whole lot of other safety considerations that survivors need to be thinking about for themselves and their children. But in Utah, one of the things that we struggled with is if someone already owns firearms and then there's the domestic violence conviction or protective order in place, relinquishing those is the tricky part, and we haven't figured out how to do that well. And so an ERPO bill would really help with that piece of it around domestic violence. So I think that the take-home message is that it's one piece of the puzzle, and that it can be really helpful when we know that some of the most frequent tragedies we're seeing in our state around firearms are in domestic violence situations.
Thank you. Chief Ross, you have heard a lot about this from me.
and many others.
And many others. And you've been in on the conversation for a long time and how law enforcement interacts with a bill like this. And I would love to pose that the same question to you. How does this impact your work? And why would it be important to your?
So first off, thank you for having law enforcement here as part of the discussion. You know, as I was involved for 4 years as the president of our Chiefs Association. I am not now, and I'm not here representing any particular law enforcement group. But I was able to talk to individuals on all sides of these issues. Different legislators are running bills, and a couple things became very evident to me early. This is a very polarizing discussion. And it became clear in my mind that if I was going to add anything to those conversations, it was going to have to be levity first. Finding some kind of common ground and balance that we can actually do something with. I am a very pragmatic person. I'm too busy to get tied up in ideology. Even though I may agree with certain things and conversations people have with me, I don't have the time to try to fight that battle. But the reality of what's existing today, and I think what most law enforcement would say, is that we have a problem. Law enforcement responds on all of these deaths. So we see it firsthand. We are with the families that are emotionally destroyed while we are trying to help investigate and determine what happened. We also are in the business of protecting people's rights, constitutional freedom, the statutes that exist, and we want to ensure that we're doing that each and every day as we are out there doing our jobs. So in looking at this, regardless of whether it's an extreme risk protective order, or I know last session we had the voluntary commitment of a firearm bill, and there's been others before, I feel personally that we need to do better than we're doing today. I can comfortably say that in front of any group, and I can also say that whether it's pro or against guns specifically or firearms in general, everyone has also said we can do better and need to do better. So I've tried to take the conversations that have come from this bill specifically, as it was first presented to me and several other chiefs and sheriffs that were part of these conversations. We knew right out of the gate that there was going to have to be changes made before we could even comfortably be able to enforce or understand or be able to play a part in this type of legislation. That's the pragmatic side of me. And as we looked at that, we also realized that there is going to be a time and a place to take a weapon from somebody to protect life. So if we can all accept that that's going to happen at some level, and that at the end of the day we are interested in reducing the deaths that occur and also protecting the rights, I think there's balance and there's some middle ground. And I'll talk about one part of this that was much easier for law enforcement than the suicide piece, even though the suicide piece is the biggest impact with death involving firearms. We know that, and other weapons. Mass shootings. I personally have struggled with when we hear and we believe we have information that tells us that somebody might be looking to do this. I think they stepped over a boundary or a line that we can just sit back and say we're going to wait and see. I would like to see us be able to be a little more proactive in being able to intervene. Contrary to what most people believe, and law enforcement is frequently blamed, every time there's a mass shooting, watch the news a week or 2 or 3 later, and they are blaming law enforcement for not preventing. I'm here to tell you right now, and I've told many in different arenas, we do not have the tools to protect like people think we do. So maybe that's something we need to look at, and if it's something that even is in a mass shooting environment, I would like to believe that we can bring people closer to the middle and actually be able to move something forward as we continue to look for ways to improve all these other issues that come with saving lives that come forward. Law enforcement is, again, kind of stuck in the middle of this. And many law enforcement officers are very strong Second Amendment supporters that probably played a role in them even deciding to get into the profession they're in. And I've always felt that and respected that, and that's important. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And sometimes I get somewhat frustrated that we are so polarized with the extreme sides of this that we end up not taking a step forward that we know in our hearts will help. And that people will feel like at least we are listening and doing something to try to intervene. And I would rather go slower and carefully do this than to jump too far where it becomes just another extreme polarized conversation that nobody really walks away from feeling like we've accomplished anything. So as I and other law enforcement sat down to discuss this bill and others, we very much, I think, we're looking at it from a balancing of the issues I just talked about, and also hoping that we could do something at the end of the day that will improve the situation from where it stands.
Great, thank you so much, and we certainly have appreciated your measured approach to it. I think a lot of times in the wake of tragedy, we have a tendency as human beings on either side of the aisle to, demand.
These are emotional
Action,
issues. It's
yes.
easy to be emotional.
And we appreciate the time you've taken to weigh in on the issue and make sure that we're not creating something that causes more problems than it fixes. So thank you very much. And then Kim Meyer, if you can talk a little bit. I know you work for a state agency. You all are doing amazing work in studying suicide and how it pertains to firearms, especially in the state, because the majority of our suicides are firearm suicides.
Yeah, so I oversee suicide prevention efforts for the state and work in the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health. And depending on the setting I'm in, I work a lot with other suicide prevention folks and suicidologists. I also work a lot with gun owners and Clark and others on these issues. And so depending on the setting I'm in, I either have to come out as a suicide prevention, a mental health person. And then in like my suicidologist settings, I have to come out as like a gun owner. So I am here and I wear both of those hats and I have both of those experiences. And I think that it's really important to realize that that's a lot of people, right? We do a lot of this and them when it's really a lot of us are kind of wearing a lot of different hats or in both those spaces. So I come with both of those perspectives. And just broadly in terms of suicide prevention efforts that we have going on, we do know that suicide is one of the leading causes of death. It's top 10 across the lifespan, and is really sort of top 5 up until kind of older age in terms of leading cause of death here. And it's really, really important that we come to the table with every available strategy to discuss and see how we can best sort of prevent this tragedy, because it has really impactful, the impact rolls through communities and families and individuals in really sort of powerful ways, and that sort of emotionally destroyed, I think, was a strong way to describe how this impacts people. And we also know when we look and study suicide, we did a recent study, we contracted out to the Harvard School of Public Health to do a study on firearms and suicide deaths in Utah, and we knew this piece, but I think one of the findings that really jumps out to folks is when we look at gun deaths in Utah, 86% of gun deaths are suicides. So when we talk about firearm safety, we have to talk about suicide prevention and what are those tools that we can use. So as we've sort of looked at best practices across the country, we've come to 3 prioritized strategies. These are outlined in the state suicide prevention plan, and they're also part of the broader Utah Health Improvement Plan, and have been adopted by lots of local communities and healthcare and people across multiple sectors. One is around access to care and making sure that when people need care, they can get it. One of the things that's come out recently in the field is the CDC released a report, which is the Federal Centers for Disease Control. They released a report that was actually called Beyond Mental Health when it comes to suicide, because we have consistently talked about suicide as a mental health issue, and clearly, like, if somebody's in that level of distress and crisis, there's a mental health component, but there's not always a mental illness component. And so we have to sort of start parsing that out and say, yes, access to care, in particular crisis care, and then care beyond for those who need it, is critically important. And that is our number 1 priority. And that also involves improving the care that people receive. But our second priority is, we refer to in sort of the speak of the field, is this idea of reducing access to lethal means. And that can include, a lot of communities do work around bridges in terms of putting up bridge barriers. But in Utah, a lot of that work is really around firearms. And we've had a coalition of partners for about 7 years that include the Utah Shooting Sports Council, that include other concealed carry instructors, other sort of advocates from the firearm community, military groups, veteran groups, and then public health and behavioral health, and all of us sort of coming together on a lot of strategies. And I just think it's really important to echo that we do have to front load this. We do need everybody to understand that when it comes to firearms, firearm safety, suicide is really what we're talking about in terms of a lot of times when it's preventing deaths, and that we all have to be prepared to have those conversations with our families, with our friends, be prepared to act on that. If you're concerned about somebody, that you reach out and say, hey, I think I'm gonna steal Clark's line quote and say, hey, can I babysit your gun for a while, right? Can I take care of that? We sort of equate it to the friends don't let friends drive drunk, right? Friends don't let friends in crisis have access to a firearm. That's really fundamental to a lot of firearm owners in terms of safety. And there, I think we do need to have conversations about what if that's not sufficient, what if that's not working. And in the field of suicidology, ERPOs have come out as another component of that strategy for people whose the thing is about crisis, right, is the very nature of crisis is that our mind narrows, our thinking narrows, and sometimes it impairs our problem solving, and it impairs our ability to think of solutions outside of where we're thinking. So sometimes we're not in a space to make those decisions, and if that's occurring, what do we do? And I think that's where a lot of people in the field, experts who study this very in-depthly, have said that ERPOs can be that sort of last-ditch tool. And so having a conversation around what that would look like in terms of suicide prevention as a core goal for the health of our communities, I think it's a really important discussion.
Great, thank you so much. No, I hear a lot from opponents of the bill, especially recently on the socials, that number one, if we remove the firearm, people will just use another tool. And can you talk a little bit about that? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it certainly is not a substitute for supporting somebody, getting people the support and care and, whatever it is that they deserve, absolutely. So in the field, we talk about this idea as means substitution, so this idea that somebody will find another way. And for some people, that might be true. And for others, for a lot of reasons that are, kind of pretty complex, but for a lot of others, they won't. And that's for a couple reasons. One is because for most folks, the peak point of a suicidal crisis to where they would act on thoughts of suicide, they might be struggling for a long time, but where they would actually sort of transfer from thinking to action is a really short period of time. You can imagine, and some of us, may have even experienced this personally, but that's a really physiologically and emotionally intense place, and we can't actually sustain it. Like, our bodies can't usually sustain that for long periods of time. It's exhausting, right? And so that can be really acute. So the whole idea of means safety strategies is around buying some time and buying some distance from a method. And so as long as we're sort of doing that, that's like the core philosophy of those environments. So yes, some people won't because they might not have another way, or they will get through that acute crisis. And if people do, almost any other method for suicide is less likely to kill somebody. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, like, for example, we have a really sophisticated medical response for overdose, right? There's a lot that we can do to medically support somebody who has had an overdose. There's very little we can do in terms of rescue after a self-inflicted gunshot wound, right? And so that's why, the idea of means substitution is an important piece of the discussion, and certainly we talk a lot about means safety with other strategies, and especially in sort of creating safe environments in the home, around medication and other things like that. But it still is really important to talk about firearms specifically for that reason.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so let's see. Last year in Utah, Representative Corey Malloy passed HB 152, which is the Safe Harbor bill, or beefed up the current Safe Harbor law, which I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the presentation or the panel, but just to reiterate, it allows somebody who's in crisis or experiencing crisis to surrender a firearm temporarily to law enforcement agency, and I believe that 152 expanded that a little bit to allow a family member to also identify somebody who's in crisis and remove the firearm and turn it over to law enforcement. Is that right, Clark?
Cohabit.
Yeah, cohabit. I would like to ask Brandon, what do you think about that, and how does that relate to an ERPO? Because we've heard a lot, like, from people around, like, I think we've already fixed the problem. We already have Safe Harbor. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know you had some feelings about it during the legislative session.
Yeah. Well, I think one takeaway from the fact that that's an
We were
option.
very supportive of that, by the way. Just wanted to make sure that that's clear. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a step in the right direction. I think one thing that we have to all realize is that collectively, whether you're a full Second Amendment rights supporter or not, we've all decided that there's a time and place where it's appropriate to have guns separated from the gun owner. Like, that's no longer a conversation, or we shouldn't, that can't be a rebuttal to the argument. On both sides, right? We've all agreed. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it does make us realize that there are situations where the gun should be separated from the gun owner. Now we have to figure out, does that law really address every situation out there? And no law is ever going to comprehensively address every single situation out there, but does it do enough? And I don't think it does. I think that's why there's so much discussion about ERPOs at state and federal level. If we thought that was a solution, then we all would have agreed and we would have moved on to save the planet or something else. But we haven't. And well, some people,
It'll be so awesome.
that's their priority. But if we're still seeing scenarios where that particular law didn't solve the problem, then we know we haven't done enough. The other thing is, I don't know if that, I would like to see an ERPR low, sorry.
You're doing great.
ERP,
We got it. Oh.
red flag law, I'm gonna say it that way.
Yeah.
That's so much easier to say it that way.
We have it in our document as EROP. That's on
Moving all the
She never
letters
makes
around.
mistakes, just never, like never, so it's a big deal for us. Okay, sorry.
I'd like to see a red flag law that addresses the issue of identifying somebody who's struggling and giving them resources so they can make it through that crisis. I think, like I said, the laws are coming, and we get to choose what kind of law we put together. But that's only if we engage and we talk about these sort of things. But I'd like to see something that automatically creates some kind of resource, because, again, like I was saying, at the end of the day, we have identified somebody that's struggling, whether it's violent urges or suicidal ideation. Either way, it's a crisis, it's a struggle, and it can't just solely be about going in and taking their guns away. It has to be about what kind of comprehensive, holistic approach do we take to help that person.
Great, and I love, Brandon's been a big proponent of some really interesting ideas, like some really out-of-the-box thinking, such as wraparound services for people who are subject to a protective order, which I think is fantastic, and I certainly think that that's something that we should be pursuing and looking into as a state, rather than just having this conversation, so we appreciate your input. Okay, Chief Ross, this question is for you. What gaps would red flag laws fill that cannot be filled by any other law in the books, no matter how well enforced they are? Or do they?
I probably
First,
won't say.
That was really leading, sorry. Leading the witness.
I probably won't say that, the way you asked me the question, I probably won't say that ERPO is the only way to do something, because I don't know. I don't know what other things are available. I don't know what other things are possible, and I'm careful to not back myself into, not even so much from a conversation standpoint, but from my own. I like to go into discussions with my brain neutral and kind of willing to be pulled different directions, and then ultimately that helps to form a discussion. So without saying, is this the only way to do something to protect our communities better than we do today, I would say there's probably other ways to do that too. And I did appreciate, not only did we work with Representative Handy and he listened to law enforcement, so did Representative Malloy, and in those conversations. And again, whether what happens in this coming legislation, then law enforcement will kind of start with that again, but hopefully it's continuing on. What I will say is, I believe we have to be able to broadly impact those that are in some type of crisis, that we have information to believe as a society that we are comfortable with. When it hits this point, law enforcement or some entity, family, law enforcement can now do something to save a life. And again, when you're looking at the continuum or on a scale, I don't think any of us would argue that when somebody's holding a gun to their head or wants to shoot themselves, anybody that's taking that weapon away from them at that time, nobody would argue and say, other than they may say you're putting yourself at risk, would argue that thing. You're taking the gun away. So now it's how far down to just nobody having guns at all? Where do we agree to go? I think that law enforcement, in the conversations I've had, there's got to be a way to better identify those with mental health conditions that are either indicating or giving signals, signs, whether reasonable cause for us to be able to take some action and take it at one time. The problem with law enforcement going in and investigating and then indicating to someone that we might be back in a week to take your gun is if somebody wants to fight against law enforcement, they will. So now it's the balance of, if law enforcement is going to do that, at what point do we feel comfortable that law enforcement can take a weapon from somebody and not have it be seen as a constitutional issue, or we're denying somebody the protection of that? I would argue that folks on the side of not doing it are probably too extreme in looking at it, and I would argue that folks on the side of why aren't you guys doing this now are too far as well. I think it's got to be identified, clear to law enforcement so we know what we're doing, and better than what we're doing today, which is much more minimal. So even with the bill that Representative Malloy was running and had a lot of some positive things to that as well, domestic violence situations, family situations, that helps with that, but it does not help with anything outside the home where they cohabitate, which can still be relationships, which can still be the person threatening or making comments about shooting up a business. Or I think we need to have a stronger ability for law enforcement to step in and take that while a person is being evaluated, and that should be a component of that as well. If it's to a point that we take your weapon, we should be taking you as well for treatment. And then I'm comfortable with a judge or someone in a process saying they can have that back.
Great, thank you so much. Which leads me to my next question. And this goes a little bit into the history of the development of the bill. In working with gun advocates, Second Amendment advocates, Clark Ocean and Brian Judy from the NRA, it was one of the biggest sticking points here is removing a firearm without due process, or what is considered to be not sufficient due process. And that is what we call the ex parte portion of the bill. Now, you said if you come and identify somebody that you're going to take their gun in a week, that escalates the unsafe nature of the crisis situation, which I think is something really important to discuss. Now, when we were working with Clark, that was one of the, if we could take out the ex parte, we wouldn't heartbeat. We don't see a safe way to do it, and we actually discussed that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what you see as what you see as potentially problematic with removing that opportunity. Especially to Erin and Kim, who are dealing with these high-level crisis situations. And maybe you can talk a little about what we found out with Kim when we were broaching that subject with you. I think it's important to know.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not like a judicial scholar, so, you know, some of these things are certainly out of my sort of area of expertise. So there's a researcher named Mike Anestis at the University of Mississippi, and he literally wrote the book called Guns and Suicide. He wrote the book. And so he's very much an expert in the field, and when this came up, I just reached out to him to ask him what his thoughts are. And, you know, the response from him and then several other sort of colleagues from the field of suicidology chimed in saying, that feels like, and we can find sort of the research to support that would increase that immediate acute risk. Again, when it comes to suicide, risk is pretty fluid, and that level of acuity is really where we're trying to intervene in. And so anything that sort of raises the acuity of risk is, you know, increases the danger of that situation. And so that's sort of where the concern from the field, I think you would see the behavioral health field, you know, if that was part of any, you know, law would express concern about that. You know, and I think also one of the things that we're really, you know, thoughtful about is we have policies and procedures, statutes in place that do really important, have really big impacts on people's lives. So we have commitment processes, and we have this emergency commitment process where if we are worried about somebody, you know, clinically being deemed a harm to self or others, we take people like against their will and like put them in like hospital, you know? And that's a pretty significant like civil, you know, like taking away of somebody's civil rights. And then definitely have a hearing sort of after if that needs to continue. So we do have sort of a process in place that's, you know, related to the idea of harm to self or others, where we do, before there's a judicial process, kind of take that right, I mean, the basic right to move around to exist in society. And it's something we take very seriously, and we're always trying to improve on in order to respect people's, you know, rights to just their basic liberties. So I think that it would just be really important to be really careful, and that we've learned a lot in that, and that we have to always do that better. But there are sort of processes in place that we can learn from that have some kind of overlap and similarities that I think are important.
Great, thank you.
I can always say something. I would just say that welcome to the most controversial part of any protective order in the domestic violence world is the ex parte part of that, because you're taking away someone's liberties or freedom in some way without them being present. So I think that because of that safety component, it would be a really important part of this bill. I haven't been as intimately involved in some of the development as our Domestic Violence Coalition partners, but I would say that the only other piece to add, and I would completely agree with what Chief Ross and Brandon, is that right? I don't know you as well, but we're gonna become friends because you are smart. I would completely agree with what both of you have said around the fact that this needs to be a part of more comprehensive services, and one of the things that domestic violence advocates have talked about nationally with ERPO bills is that, I hate to say this in a microphone, actually Utah's never gonna let me come back again, but sometimes ERPOs can escalate violence for domestic violence survivors. And so, again, they are not a panacea. They are not the only thing that we need when it comes to domestic violence situations. And the number one thing when I worked crisis lines and worked one-on-one with survivors is around safety planning and making sure that they're very clear that, and it's the same with protective orders. We tell them the same thing with any kind of protective order. The minute you are getting the judicial system involved in your life, you could be escalating violence from the person who is the abuser. And so I think we just wouldn't, in any kind of legislative process, we want to look at what are those unintended consequences and how do we make sure that we're implementing this in a way that's truly meeting our intended outcome, which is to keep people safe. And so I think that piece in the domestic violence world in particular is important to help people realize this could be actually a trigger, no pun intended, and how do we plan around that? We have to plan around that for 100 things as domestic violence survivors. So it's not that it's not doable, but we need to be talking about it, and it needs to be part of that conversation as well.
Great, thank you so much. And then we're kind of coming up on time, maybe?
We got 12 minutes.
We have 12 minutes.
Oh, okay.
You don't need to whisper.
Yes,
It's-
we don't.
it's secret.
Okay, well, they're figuring that out. I don't know what's happening over here, but I want to talk a little bit about what Erin brought up, which is a really important thing that we need to address when we're talking about this as a state and what we're going to do to address this issue, and that is that sometimes the presence of judiciary or law enforcement can escalate a crisis. Sometimes that happens. Now, in the past, in our study, we have an expert here, and she will be the first one to tell you, and everybody should probably talk to Monica if you have questions. She knows way more than I do. But most of the time in states that have a law like this, these are applied with no problem. They're not problematic. The black robe effect kicks in when somebody is in crisis and they don't recognize that they're in crisis. Most of the time, there's no incident. The weapons are relinquished, the person gets the mental the help that they need and there's not an incident. However, there is that very small percentage of time when the presence of law enforcement can escalate the crisis. And that's something we worked really closely with Chief Ross and the Law Enforcement Legislative Coalition on to make sure that that's not something that you were uncomfortable with, right? And I don't know if you remember that.
No, I do remember that.
That was the scariest day of my life.
It was, it's easy to talk about and not be present when it's happening about how the benefits play out, but when you're there trying to make it happen, it's much more difficult. And what law enforcement has found themselves in over the last several years, maybe even decade or so, is for anytime we're going to use force, the Supreme Court has ruled, and the courts are looking closely at, does the action that we're taking, the force we're taking, justify why we are there in the first place? And if it doesn't, that force should not have been used. So a great example is if all you've done is sped in your car, and somehow I use all great levels of force and you aren't using a weapon against me, that doesn't justify that outcome. And so law enforcement over the years has been scaling back certain things. For example, in my career, which has spanned 31 years, if we were called on a suicidal individual barricaded in a room, we'd call out the SWAT team and they would show up, and at some point we could be kicking a door and putting gas in and to get that person out because we were going to save their lives. And every once in a while, small percentage, but enough, people were killing themselves while law enforcement was trying to get in to protect them. And the courts have ruled that's not justified. So as we're talking about going in and taking something, a weapon from someone that may emotionally want to resist, one of the things that was important to all of the law enforcement that participated, and this is including prosecutors and others, is that we have the ability to back out. So if we show up and we make a judgment call on seeing that by us trying to push this forward, we actually put our people and even the individual that we're trying to help in more risk, shy of this being a threat against the public or more than their own life. This is a suicide situation, that we could back out and leave, and that we would not be liable for that. Everything that we're doing always has this balance of, well, yeah, you left, and now this person got hurt right after the fact. So there was a willingness to listen to that, and there was language that was added in that would give us that ability to try to deal with that. The ex parte part of this is very, very hard for law enforcement. And you heard me say earlier from being present in I don't know how many meetings and conversations about these issues over 4+ years, that I believe we have to be able to do something immediate. I do not believe it is in the best interest for us to do something and then alert to what we're going to do and then come back. I think that is a bigger risk. But in order to do that, when does that kick in is very conflicted in law enforcement, and I'm not even as clear. So even as we talked about suicide, mass shooting, I'm good. I've come to a point in my discussions, in the education I've had, that if you're going to threaten to do a mass killing of any type, we should take whatever you have that we think you could use, and we should take you in to get help, all at the same time, and be done. And that's something I think we should all agree with. And then where it goes from there, it's a harder path. It's a tougher road, because people don't even know when to notify people for help when they're talking about suicide, let alone what the method of it might be. That was part of my input as we were having these discussions, is we're talking to families that are devastated after a suicide occurs, and every person close to that individual is saying, why didn't I do something? And I'm telling them that you can't put that burden on you, because there's so much that has led up to this, that if you live your life based on I can never let anyone close to me die, you will completely kidnap your own life, and you will never be able to lead them, and you will do things to them that will be detrimental to them as well. And because of all of that, That makes the gun piece hard.
Yeah.
But it is the number one use of successful suicide, and that's why I believe it has to be part of the conversation.
Great.
It's too easy to say otherwise.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're really coming up on time.
So we have a guest here, and that's kind of a nice segue from what you were talking about with the mass shootings. Not that that's a nice topic, but we have a guest here, Carolyn Tuft, who is a survivor of the Trolley Square shooting. And I'd like to invite her to come up and speak. I was just alerting them. We have a guest here today, Carolyn Tuft, who is a survivor of the Trolley Square shooting. And I'd just like to invite her to come up today and say a few words about that in relation to this bill. So come on.
Hi, just kind of off the cuff because I was speaking at a rally we were having Saturday to promote red flag laws and background checks, and I was seen by Monica and invited to come here. But anyway, yeah, I was a survivor of the Trolley Square shooting. I was shot 3 times, twice at point blank range with a pistol grip shotgun, and my daughter was murdered. After the fact, I'd had dinner with the shooter's aunt, and I met his dad and sat with his family, and come to find out that the kid had a lot of problems. He was a loner, he collected guns, he had made a lot of threats, he had even told his girlfriend that he was going to do something. And these people, there was no red flag law, but had there been one that people knew was an avenue that they could use, and they could have reported him, but they didn't know they had any options. They were terrified of him. His aunt told me she was terrified of him. She wished his mother would have reported him, but they were scared. And I just feel like people need to know that they have an option, that if somebody around them is scaring them, if somebody around them who is a loner and has guns and has a bad, angry temper, I think that people need to keep their eyes open and realize they do have an option, that they can report this person, at least have them checked out. Maybe there isn't a risk, but maybe there is, and then they can say something and have it checked. Sorry, my vocabulary's not great right now, but I wanted to say also that I'm part of Moms Against, what is wrong with my brain? Moms Demand Action, Gun Sense University, and we wear orange for certain things because it's the color of safety, and we had an event that I needed to wear orange for, or orange banquet, and so I went shopping to find something orange, and the girl who was checking me out said, "What do you want orange clothes for?" And so I told her, and I didn't know this person, but she said, "Is there anything I can do? I live with my in-laws, and I have a 3-year-old daughter, and my father-in-law is an alcoholic, and he keeps his handgun on the coffee table and refuses to let anybody move it, but he wields it around because he's angry, and he's always drunk, so he's always angry." And she said she's terrified to let her child be there, but she has no other option for daycare. She's scared that every time he gets upset, he's going to shoot her or her daughter. And I told her, well, we're working on red flag laws, but report him. But there's so many people like this who live in trauma, and they're scared, and they don't feel like they have any options and don't know what to do. I feel like we need to give them some options. Let them report where, Anyway, our shooting could have been prevented. Oh, sorry, I back up. My brain's all over the place today. Besides the red flag law, with my shooter, they sold him the gun illegally because he was too young to purchase the gun that he used. It was a pistol grip shotgun, and he was 18, and the legal purchase is 21. So we need to get better background checks. Anyway, thanks for letting me speak.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for for that. Okay, so we are gonna wrap up, and we just wanna thank our panelists so much. Round of applause for our panelists. And thank you so much to Carolyn for really highlighting the importance of this conversation and why it's so urgent that we have it. And thank you for all of the attendees who came here. I hope that you will involve yourselves in this bill development, and I hope you'll contact your legislators and talk to them about the best options. I hope you will go to Brandon Roper and talk to him about his out-of-the-box ideas for how we can make this a better bill so that it actually provides wraparound care for the people who are in crisis. I hope that you'll join Action Utah and follow us on the socials and the Facebooks and all of the things that we have. We'll be hosting events like this on a number of different issues throughout the year leading up to the legislative session. Not this one in particular. We are not a gun organization or suicide prevention interested. But if you are interested in saving the world from climate change, we're your gals. And then also I wanted to, I think I'm supposed to point out all of the other coalitions who support legislation such as this, the Suicide Prevention Coalition. Been working closely with, like I said, law enforcement, but outside that, all of our congressional delegation on a federal level has spoken in support of this after the recent rash of shootings that we had a couple of weeks ago. President Trump has spoken in favor of red flag bills and a number of other really important, thoughtful organizations such as the FBI, School Safety Council. This has been supported by the, what are those people called, and they try to keep you safe, Monica? Security, something. Yes, crosswalk officers. I can't speak for them as an organization, but I know a lady who supports this. Anyway, this is gaining vast support, and I think it's really important that we are having the conversation so that we get it right in our state. So we're providing the most help targeted to the people who need it the most specifically. All right, thank you so much, and please feel free to ask us any questions or stick around or leave screaming. You can do any of those things.